So thanks for joining. So I'm Melanie Archer, and I'm General Counsel for RE/MAX Estate Properties. One of the things I kind of want to tell you a little bit about is my background in case I'm new to any of you out there who are watching. I've been an attorney for 10 years. I've always been in real estate and business and started in the litigation field, so dealing with mediations, arbitrations, disputes, and everything related to real estate as well as business disputes between partners and companies. So that's kind of my background. I've been with RE/MAX for over a year now, working with their agents, helping stay compliant, dealing with risk management, and general advice. So today on this webinar, really what I'm going to be providing is insight into the things that we've discussed, things that I've noticed over the past couple of weeks with coronavirus in particular, and how to navigate the real estate industry in this environment, which is ever changing. So the first thing I want to mention is the ever changing nature of this environment. I did a webinar with you guys about 2 weeks ago, and the day after I did that webinar, one of the rules changed. I think it was actually that afternoon after we had spoken, the rules changed. So if you ever feel like a ping pong ball that's getting hit back and forth and back and forth, it is exactly like what we are right now. We are the ping pong ball. And so the best thing we can do is do things like come on to these webinars, whether it's me, another speaker, anywhere you can find information to get updated on what is happening right now in the market and in our industry, as well as the greater United States and California economy. So before I kind of dive in, I have 4 topics I'm going to talk about. Before I dive in, if you have a question, if you could please put it in the question and answer section. If you look down towards the bottom of your screen and roll your mouse around, you should be able to see something that says Q&A. You can go ahead and type in your question there, and I will take breaks to look at the Q&A, make sure that I answer your questions. The whole point of me being here today is to try and hit topics that are important to you. And so I'm really interested in those questions to see where you want this conversation to head. So I have 4 topics that are on my mind that I was going to discuss today, and then we can open it up to any other areas of interest for you. The first that I was going to discuss is the economy, housing, what's happening right now in the market. Understanding a forecast of where we've been in the last couple of weeks helps us identify some issues and potential pitfalls that we'll meet in the next couple of weeks. So I'm going to go over that a little bit. The second thing I want to touch upon very briefly are the new forms that CAR has put out, kind of explaining what they are, when you would use them, things like that. The third thing I'm going to touch upon briefly is the PPP, which is the Payroll Protection Program, as well as the PUA, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, and the EIDL, which I never remember what it means, so I have to read that one, Economic Injury Disaster Loan. So the three programs that really affect small businesses that were put in place from the CARES Act, which is the $2 trillion stimulus package that was passed a couple of weeks ago. So I'm going to touch very briefly upon those. And I'm also going to touch upon the safer at home orders in Los Angeles County. And those were revised on April 10th. And then over the weekend, we've received some clarification, as many of you, I'm sure, have heard from your brokerages about that. So we're going to go over that as well. So what I want to start with is kind of a general overview of where we are in the housing market. Unemployment claims are still rising. We had 6.6 million unemployment claims last week. And over the last 4 weeks, we've had over 17 million claims. That's about half of the number of claims that we saw in the recession in 2007, 2008, over the entire recessionary period. And that's happened in a matter of 4 weeks for us, 50% of that unemployment. So we've largely lost the jobs that were created in the last 10 years. That said, more unemployment claims are anticipated to come if the government funding isn't coming through the way that businesses have been expecting. Some businesses have been holding on to employees with the anticipation of getting those payroll protection programs funded. And we may see a rise in unemployment still if that funding doesn't come through. And we also may see a slight downtick in unemployment depending on which states are opening up their safer at home, stay at home orders to allow people to go back to work. But remember, those people who are going back to work are largely not the unemployed people. So the numbers are a little skewed right now. They make for really salacious headlines, but as far as truly understanding the depth of the unemployment issue and how it's going to impact our economy right now is not particularly known, and it will unfold probably very clearly in the coming 2 to 4 weeks as different states have people slowly head back to certain jobs. So CAR put out a poll. How does this all affect our housing market? The unemployment bone is connected to the consumer spending bone, is connected to the consumer confidence bone. So because these are all connected, as we see unemployment rise, we see consumer spending drop, as well as consumer confidence. If you're going out and you're spending the money on that, that car that you've always wanted, it doesn't happen so much because we're not driving. Are you going to go ahead and extend yourself for that home, that dream home, instead of staying in the house that you are in because you know it's comfortable, you can live there? All sorts of questions right now related to how confident are consumers in the general economy where they feel comfortable spending their money, putting their money in someone else's pocket. So how does that affect housing? CAR has been polling people, and if you log on and you can answer any of their polls, please take the time to do so that we get accurate information on this stuff. That a number of properties have been pulled off market. They said back in March it was as high as 54% had been pulled off the market. There is a general tightening of inventory, which has been very interesting because the median home price has stayed relatively stable. So price has not been greatly impacted. As we're all following, we're seeing some price reductions. We're seeing sellers become more flexible in price. And that is happening, but not as significantly or substantially as we're seeing it in other industries within the United States. So the median home price has stayed relatively stable so far. So that is a promising piece of information. However, we are seeing constricted inventory as sellers are pulling properties off the market when they don't actually have to sell. We're also seeing a decrease in new listings, fewer listings, and a substantial decrease from this same time last year. Something about mortgages that I thought was interesting going through our economic overview is that forbearance, meaning what is forbearance? Forbearance is a lender's agreement not to foreclose, right? So they're forbearing, they're stopping from foreclosing on your property. Mortgage forbearance has gone up by 1,400%, which sounds horrifying, but it's actually still pretty low. After the 2008 crisis, during the 2008 crisis, we saw a huge increase in mortgage forbearance as well as foreclosures. We're not at that point. This is not, I think, going to look, touch, smell, or feel like the 2008 crisis in the housing industry. We will be impacted, but I don't believe, and this is my personal opinion, I don't believe we're actually going to have the same intense impact on housing, foreclosures, short sales, things of that nature, because we're not the root and the core of the industries that are being affected. The industries that are being deeply affected by this are hospitality, as well as tourism and travel. Those are the industries that are going to feel this and be hit the hardest through this time. So we are seeing a slowing of homes entering into escrow throughout California, but that amount of slowing is slowing. So even though fewer homes are entering into escrow as they were pre-crisis or at this time in March, the decline in numbers is actually slowing down, which is very promising going into the summer months. And as I mentioned, the median home prices are staying relatively strong. There are reductions, but they're not in line with drops in other areas. So that's kind of the economic overview that we're dealing with. And how does that impact your business? What it's going to entail during this time, and I'm going to get into the safer at home orders and showings and things like that, which is, I know, the hot topic of the moment after all of this stuff. One of the big things to understand is that real estate is still selling, that people are still looking to buy properties, people are still looking to sell properties. And so much of this is going to depend on your ability to pivot and really be able to focus on what can you offer your clients sitting from your desk during these Zoom calls. How can you change your business to create a more virtual connection with your client and understand how to meet their needs from afar. Our old traditional methods of open houses, brokers opens, caravans, showing any property, anytime, anywhere, showing occupied properties, tenant occupied properties, having tenants leave. Let's say you had a single family property and you wanted to issue a 60-day notice and sell the property vacant. Well, that's not feasible right now because of eviction moratoriums. So much of this is going to depend on how you can pivot and communicate this information to your client to help them sell in this time. And even if things open up, even if the governors say certain people can go back to work for certain circumstances, I don't actually see a huge shift in our industry and how we're able to sell for quite a while, potentially through the end of the year, because they are saying that we are an essential business already. So if they do open up the economy, they're going to open up to other essential businesses. We are already essential. I don't see them substantially loosening a lot of our restrictions through the end of this year. So we do need to understand that this is how it will be for the foreseeable future. And even if it changes, great. If coronavirus goes away tomorrow, wonderful. But the more you can prepare for this to be your current new normal, the better off you're going to be, the more equipped you're going to be the one who's actually selling the house during COVID-19. So keep all of that in mind. Things are still selling and moving, but we are in for some interesting changes in the economy as well as home sales as time goes. So I'm going to switch now. I see some of the questions coming in. This is great. Owner-occupied vacant properties. I'm going to get to those shortly. So I'm going to move forward from kind of an economic overview to the new CAR form. So CAR is doing their best. So, I've spoken to some of the council up there. They're doing their best to stay updated, keep these forms updated, and address issues that have arisen with the forms. Keep in mind that when these forms came out, I'm talking about the coronavirus forms, they came out rapidly. They tried to get them out as quickly as possible as things were changing in those first few weeks. And since then, they've revised the forms to address issues that have come up with the forms. And my guess is they will continue to revise them. If you think about how they normally do it, they normally do it every 6 months. It goes through forms committee. It's very vetted. Sometimes I see them review them. I mean, we really, they have the benefit of time, and they haven't had the benefit of time here, getting these forms out and in use and really thinking through every avenue. So expect, this is a new set of revisions. Expect more revisions because they will come. So the forms that they revised were the CVA, the coronavirus addendum, the NUCC, the notice of coronavirus circumstances, and the PEAD, which is the form that you'll use anytime anyone's entering a property, and then the RLA-CAA, which is the listing addendum amendment, the coronavirus listing addendum. And they've updated all of those to include additional exculpatory language, meaning additional language that helps protect you and helps protect your clients. Those are the main changes that they've made in all of those, but be sure you're using the most updated form, and you can get all of those online. They also came out with 3 new forms that are important to know about. Number 1 is the coronavirus addendum, which we all have seen for purchases. They now have one for landlord-tenant situations. They also have the NUCC, the notice of unforeseen conditions for tenants and landlords. And they also have the PEAD, where you're entering properties for landlords and tenants. So keep in mind, there are 2 separate sets of these forms. One is for purchase and sales, and the other one's for a landlord-tenant circumstance. And the main difference is, of course, they call them landlord and tenant versus buyer and seller. But the landlord-tenant forms are actually much more tailored to those circumstances because you're not in escrow, you don't have contingencies, you're not purchasing the property, you're just coming to rent it. So it has different circumstances in which you would use those forms. But again, as you watched my webinar last time, the PEAD, which is the notice to everybody about coronavirus, if you're entering, the risks, the issues, that you take that risk on yourself, that you understand that that everything needs to be in compliance with the CDC. It also puts the onus on the seller to clean the property after every single showing. The PEAD is so important for our agents. It's mandatory. It's so important for every single time you show a property. If you're showing in a legal, if it's legal where you're showing, that you use that form. Every person that enters the property, including real estate agents, and the people who live there, occupy it, own it, visit it, all of it, photographers, inspectors, everybody should be signing that PEAD anytime you're doing anything at a property during the coronavirus pandemic. So that's it right now for forms. If you have any questions about those forms, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, but I don't see any at the moment, so I'm going to move on to the next topic, which is kind of government assistance-based information. So the number one question I get from our agents is, what is the difference between the PPP and the PUA? Now, everyone loves acronyms, but they're very confusing. And then people say, well, I never got my PUA, meaning Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, and now it's saying the money's run out. What's happening? Well, fear not, that money has not run out yet. That money has not run out. The money that has been exhausted is the money that is being sent through the SBA, the Small Business Administration. The SBA programs are the PPP and something called the EIDL, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. What are those two things, and how is it different than the PUA, or the Unemployment Assistance? The PPP stands for Paycheck Protection Program. That was the most popular of the SBA loans that were being offered as part of the CARES Act. The PPP allows for an employer, so you have to have an employee, a W-2 employee, an employer to get payroll assistance. Meaning I could apply, let's say I'm an employer and I have 5 employees, I could apply for the PPP, for the Payroll Protection Program, and the government, the SBA, would give me a loan, and that loan could cover up to 2.5 months of my payroll. I have to use those funds in a very specific way. I have to qualify in a very specific way. But if I get those funds, I get to use them to pay for my payroll, as well as a couple other things. And at the end of it, if I spent it all correctly, if I followed all the guidelines correctly, that loan is forgivable, meaning I wouldn't have to pay it back. You have to apply for the forgivability. There's a whole bunch of things you have to do, but in an oversimplified way, the PPP helps employers pay their payroll, and it can help towards rents, utilities, things like that, but mostly payroll. So individual real estate agents are not applying for PPP as independent contractors. They have not opened that up to independent contractors. And in fact, the SBA announced last week that their funds have been exhausted. So people who applied for it and got earmarked are possibly, I think they're still funding, but new applicants are being rejected currently. And it's in front of the legislature in order to try and increase that funding to allow for more loans to be processed through the SBA. So that's PPP. The Economic Injury Disaster Loan is also through the SBA, and it gives up to $10,000 for small businesses. I'm not as familiar with that one, so I don't want to talk about it in case I go off in the wrong direction. But it is through the SBA. It's one of the programs, I think, that's hitting the, having the funds be dried up currently, that they're trying to get more funding to in order to allow small businesses to get up to the $10,000 to help their operations. My understanding, and don't quote me on this one, but my understanding with the EIDL is it's also not eligible for independent contractors. But if you are interested in it, please check on your own, because that one I'm not certain about. The one that you are eligible for independent contractors and realtors is the PUA, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance. We know of unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance has been around, and people can apply to it, except it hasn't been permitted for independent contractors. You've had to have an employer who's been paying into unemployment for a period of time, and then you can go ahead and get your unemployment insurance. Well, the CARES Act created the PUA, which is the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, and that is something that an independent contractor can apply for under certain circumstances. You have to remember, though, it is only coronavirus-related unemployment. So if you just happen to have low sales and you just happen to have a bad month, you've got to look into your eligibility, figure out if it would apply to you. Because it really is intended for people who are unemployed or reach some level of unemployment. It doesn't have to be full unemployment, but due to coronavirus. Maybe you have kids at home, maybe you're caring for someone who's sick, all sorts of different reasons. CAR has a great Q&A on the PUA. A lot of acronyms, but they have a good Q&A on the PUA, that I recommend you look on their website. They do a good job of providing that information. It will not be available to start applying for, they said, until about next week. The government was set up for unemployment insurance. They had all of the systems and processes in place. They were staffed. They were ready. When PUA was announced from the CARES Act, they were not ready. They didn't know it was coming. So they've spent the last month setting themselves up in order to be able to process all of the applications they expect are going to be coming through from independent contractors. So that unemployment number that we talked about at the beginning of this webinar is going to, I don't know if they'll even count in it the people who are going to be applying for the PUA or the unemployment assistance program who are independent contractors. So it's another variable that we really don't know about yet, but stay tuned, stay on it, start looking, I would start looking on Friday if you're somebody who is looking to apply for it, in hopes that you'll get more information and that by Monday, if it's available, you can be ready to apply. So that is those are all of the government programs that I think are going to be impactful for our community, our realtor community and real estate community that have come through from the CARES Act. And again, the PUA is what you would be looking at if you're going to be looking to apply for unemployment assistance. You can find a lot of information about that on CAR's website. So I encourage you to go there. They do a nice job. Then I'm going to look really quickly. Okay, so we have a question about the PEAD. If I represent a buyer, from Maggie, if I represent a buyer for a showing, a buyer signed the PEAD is needed, but do I also need to get a seller signed copy specifically for my buyer before my buyers enter? A buyer signed PEAD is needed, but do I also need to get a seller signed copy specifically for my buyers? Okay, so you don't, the PEAD is property specific, it's not party specific. So you do need a PEAD from your seller if your seller will be at the property at all during the coronavirus pandemic. Then you would need one for your seller, but you need one for your seller for that property. You won't need one for your seller specifically for that buyer. So each party will need to sign one for each property that they're visiting or allowing people to visit. So the seller will sign it once for their property, and then the buyer will sign it for each property they go to visit, because it's property specific, not party specific. So I'm going to dismiss the question, Maggie, but if I didn't answer it or you have a follow-up, go ahead and put it in there. And then the rest of the questions go to showing homes. So I'm going to go right into that now. This is our fourth kind of area that I think is going to be really important to discuss today, which is showing. What has happened? It has been, like I said, that little ping pong ball. I feel like a ping pong ball. We go one direction, we go another direction. We go this direction and that direction. So I'm going to give you a little overview, kind of the history. And I say history because it feels like it's been years, but it's actually been weeks. A little history about what's kind of been happening. So LA County set out their safer at home order, right? Their safer at home order originally said real estate sales and anything incidental thereto essential. Okay, so we thought, great, we can go sell real estate. No open houses, no brokers opens, be smart about it, but you can go sell. Then the state said, these are our essential businesses, and we were not included. So we then took a step back. We were not an essential business. We couldn't practice real estate, even though the county said you could. It conflicted with the state's order. So for a little while, a couple days, we thought, oh gosh, we can't go out. You can't leave your house to sell real estate. Then the federal government changed their definition of essential services and included us. That made the state include us as well. So all of a sudden, we're back. We're an essential service. This is great. We can do showings with CDC guidelines, following all precautions, proper protocol, no open houses, no brokers opens, nothing like that. Do everything virtual if you can, but you can show in the county of Los Angeles. Well, something happened, and that was on April 10th, which is 10 days ago now, and the county, very quietly, I might add, amended their safer at home order. And what did they amend it to? I don't have it memorized, so be patient with me while I pull it up. They said that residential and commercial real estate are essential businesses, and anything incidental thereto, things like virtual tours, photographers, inspections, okay, provided that appointments and other residential viewings must only occur virtually. Okay. If a virtual viewing is not feasible, and we'll get back to that feasible issue, by appointment and with no more than 2 visitors at a time who reside together within the same household, and 1 individual showing the unit can go in. And then there's this parenthetical. It says, except that in-person visits are not allowed when the occupant is still residing in the residence. That is the parenthetical that sent everybody scrambling. And the reason is it seems to say, okay, LA County, you can show only if virtual is not feasible. And then you can only do with 2 people at a time. They must reside together, meaning they don't want cross-contamination amongst households, and the agent who's showing it with you. But then this last parenthetical that says, except in-person visits are not allowed when the occupant is still residing in the residence. Well, the way to interpret that would be, well, someone resides there if they live there, whether or not they're in the building at the time. So we all understood it, as well as Carr did too, to mean that you could only show vacant properties. And that's where that came out. And last week, I'm sure you all received emails from your brokers, as well as if you were attending any of the CAR conferences, which your brokers are usually invited to, that no showings in Los Angeles County unless the property was vacant or didn't have occupants. Well, what happened this weekend is there were a flurry of emails that were going back and forth with the Los Angeles County Council. Those are the attorneys who advise the county. And the county council was part of an email chain with CAR, a part of it, that basically said that they agree with the interpretation that if the person who lives there is not in the property at that time, then the occupant is not in the residence, which would seem like you can show a property that's occupied in Los Angeles County, so long as the occupant is not in the building, they're not there, and you're limited to those 2 people who are in the same household and the showing agent. Note, by the way, that it doesn't include 2 people, a showing agent and an inspector, or 2 people, a showing agent and a photographer. Just says 2 people and a showing agent. So this email, which myself and every other general counsel, as well as CAR counsel that I know, we are seeking further really concrete confirmation from the county. We're actually asking them to update the order so it's much more clear. As far as we know from this email with county council, showings, if virtual is not feasible, then showings in LA County are permissible with these restrictions. And there are more restrictions we all know about. You have to clean after every single showing. The seller is required to clean the property after every showing. You have to maintain 6 feet of social distance, even amongst the realtor and these folks. You have to wear masks. And we wipe down surfaces, do everything of that nature. So there are still all the normal CDC guidelines, but as far as we know, sitting here today, like that little ping pong ball we are, because tomorrow we might be over here and the next day we might be over there. But the form of our ping pong ball right now is that our understanding from county council in Los Angeles is the occupant cannot be in the building, cannot be there at the time, in the unit at the time of the showing, and a virtual showing cannot be feasible. And then we think it's permitted. Now I say we think because no one right now knows for certain. And I know we would love to hear the advice of yes, you can do it, or no, you can't. So I'm giving you all of the information that I have currently and that I'm able to get my fingers on. And as I mentioned, it could change this afternoon. I have messages out to county council, city council, and CAR. Hopefully I'll hear back from them and know much more where I can draw that black and white line. But that is the best information we have at this time, is that we have received confirmation from county council that as long as the occupant is not in the property, not occupying the property at the time of the showing. So I want to come back to the words, if a virtual viewing is not feasible. What does feasible mean? It is not a perfectly defined term, and it's going to be a matter of interpretation. The way I interpret it is if it's really not possible, not if the house doesn't look as pretty on a virtual tour, or if the photographs are a little gray and so we don't like it. That doesn't make it that doesn't make it not feasible to do a virtual tour. Things that would make it not feasible to do a virtual tour are, for example, gosh, it's really hard to think of some. If any of you have some, I'd really be interested in hearing them. But so, for example, let's say it's not a real estate agent, but let's say it's a property. Oh, let's say you are, it's a property manager and they're managing a property in a city that they can't go to. And so they have to, someone has to be let in over there, either by a lockbox with a code, and so they can go do a physical tour, because a virtual tour is not feasible because they can't show the property, they can't go in there to take video and whatnot. So they have to actually physically go to the property. But virtual tours are largely feasible, even if they're ugly, even if they're grainy, even if they don't give a great perspective on the floor plan, and therefore you don't think you'd be as interesting to as many buyers. The virtual tour cannot be feasible in order for you actually to do a showing. So that's the latest. That's where we are right now. It could change within the hour. For all I know, by the time I get off this webinar, my email could be full of new information. I could have heard back from county council and everything could change. So you do really need to try and stay updated as much as possible, because it's changing rapidly and it's not particularly clear, which is why it's changing so quickly. So I'm going to go through a couple of the questions. Feel free to add your questions in the Q&A, and the rest of this is going to be Q&A. I have nothing else in particular to lecture on, so I want to make sure it's pointed to where you guys want to have information discussed. So if you can show vacant properties. So in the county of Los Angeles, again, if the virtual tour is not feasible, you can absolutely show a vacant property. I don't think there's any question with a vacant property. With a vacant property, again, though, a virtual tour has to not be feasible. And then as far as how you show those properties, again, you have to follow CDC guidelines. Check out CAR's website. They've got a great guidelines on how to show a property when you're allowed to. It includes social distancing, face masks. You have to wipe down all surfaces. The seller has to clean after every showing. And then on the new county rule, if the virtual tour is not feasible and it's vacant, there's no question, 2 people maximum, they have to have been in a household, basically living together, plus the agent. So next question, is force majeure enforceable in residential real estate deals falling out of escrow? Is it an excuse to bail out of escrow? I'm going to put that one on pause really fast and come back to it for force majeure, because it's a little bit more of a conversation. So I'll come back to that. Can you please confirm that LA County Council confirms that as long as the owner and sellers are not at home at the time of the showings and we follow the safety protocols outlined by CAR, that we can now show occupied homes? So that goes back to what we just discussed. I know your question came in before I went over that. So I have seen that email. I got a copy of it. And county council seems to confirm that interpretation, that the person just needs to be out of the house. But again, this is only if a virtual showing is not feasible. And because it's county council's interpretation, I feel much stronger if I see it in the order, but that is their interpretation. I've confirmed, I've seen that email, and I wish it was a bit stronger, but it's what we've got. So it's what we're going with. Is staging and photography considered essential? Them on their own, they're not essential businesses, but because the language of the county order says residential and commercial real estate and anything incidental thereto, we are of the understanding that staging and photography as it relates to residential and commercial real estate sales would be covered. But just photography in general is not a covered essential business. So for example, if they were going to go out and start photographing, you know, they're an architectural photographer and they just want to go visit places and photograph, they would not be deemed an essential business on their own. Tenant occupied. So a tenant occupied property is going to be treated the same as an owner occupied property under this particular rule. So with a tenant occupied property, the same thing is viewing feasible. If it is feasible, is virtual viewing feasible? If it is feasible, you have to do it virtually. If it's not feasible, then we've got to follow that same guidance with no more than 2 people. The tenant can't be there, and no more than 2 people from the same household with the agent. The other thing with tenants occupying that I've been asked is, what if the tenant just refuses? Well, pre-coronavirus, if a tenant refused to allow a prospective buyer, it was usually a breach of the lease agreement, because in the CAR leases, there is a provision that says the tenant must allow showings with 24 hours notice. And if they didn't do that, the landlord would issue a notice to cure or quit, meaning you're in breach of your lease. So we had a lot of power there. Well, the problem now is if a tenant refuses to allow a showing, what are you going to do? Can't evict them. Can't evict them. The courts are saying you cannot evict a tenant due to coronavirus circumstances. And on top of that, they've closed the courts entirely to evictions, except for ones that affect the health and safety of people. So if a tenant refuses and is technically in breach of their lease, which allows showings, there's really no enforcement mechanism to do anything about it. The second thing is, I think a judge, even if they did hear it, I don't see any judge forcing a tenant to allow someone in their home during coronavirus. I just don't see it. Is it possible? Could I be wrong? Yes. But I don't see anybody forcing someone to let someone in their home during coronavirus. So tenant occupied falls under the same rules, but you have a different issue, which is enforcement. The seller's motivated to let people in if they feel comfortable. A tenant is not. So if there's a virtual on the MLS already, the house cannot be shown. That's a great question. So I think under the rules, if the virtual viewing, because it's feasible, it's on the MLS, I don't think you fall into the category of being able to show it. If a virtual tour is feasible, you must show it virtually. And how would an agent find out about the showing restrictions in other counties? That's a great question. CAR actually has a form that they have filled out. I'll put the link in the chat if you just give me a moment. And they have actually, I'll put the link to the legal documents right now. And then it's in the chat. So if you don't see the chat, go ahead and find a chat button on your Zoom, click on it, it'll pop up. I just put it in there. And if you look down at their guides and other materials, they have stay-at-home orders by city and county. They try to update it every single week. So you got to make sure that you're looking at the most updated one. The second link I just put in the chat is the actual form. And take a look at that. That should have it by city and county. It doesn't have all cities. It has as many as they can find, but that's your best resource for it. Next question is feasible, like practical. So if it's not practical, I think feasible means, is it doable? Is really a virtual tour doable? And it's open to interpretation. It's not a perfect word. And I think that they did that. They do that often on purpose. So you're going to really have to use your best judgment in each situation to determine if it's feasible. And if you have any question whatsoever, make sure you talk to your broker, because your broker ultimately is going to be the one to help you through these individual on-the-cusp decisions about how best to do tours or showings and under what circumstances. So I would rely heavily on your broker in order to figure out those issues on the margin. Does the seller need to participate in videoing the property for the visual tour? They don't have to. No, they don't have to participate. But if a seller can feasibly get a virtual tour in there, that's a good point about feasibility, by the way. So if you have a seller who doesn't understand how to take a video or do a virtual tour, it may be that that's one of those circumstances where it's not feasible to do a virtual tour. And so you need to get a photographer or videographer in there. And so that would be one of those circumstances. That's another area where you could say, well, it's not feasible. My client has no clue how to do a virtual tour. Again, these are all things that are going to be case by case and ultimately be on the margin. Is the seller required to clean every showing if the property is vacant? There's no exception for vacant properties. It treats all properties the same. All properties are required to be cleaned after every single showing. Condominiums, common areas, can you show if you're going by other condos? I'm not sure I understood that last question, but I'm not aware of any distinction between condominiums versus single family homes. I'm not aware of any of that. These are just general, really broad rules for all real estate. So you would have to, I don't think there's any exception for condos, anything like that. Are showing rules, restrictions the same in Orange County and in Riverside? I don't know because I don't do this stuff there, but take a look at the link that I put in the chat for county by county assessment, and CAR is digging into that since they deal with all of California. Okay, I'm going to go back up to one of the top questions, the force majeure, because this Q&A is much longer than I expected. So I'm going to go back up to that force majeure, and then I'll go through some more of the questions. And what I'm going to try and do is areas that I've already discussed, I'm going to dismiss those and then head into the questions that I really haven't talked about yet, so that I'm not just repeating myself for those of you who asked the question maybe before I provided the answer. So force majeure, I want to talk about that for a moment. What is a force majeure? Force majeure is a reference to a clause that we see in many contracts. It basically provides for, and I don't actually remember the definition on major force, I'm assuming is what force majeure means. I would Google it if I wasn't on a webinar right now, but I'm not sure what exactly it means. But the concept behind it is usually that there's an excuse in performance of a contract due to some condition that was not foreseeable. And oftentimes it's things like earthquakes, natural disasters, pandemics, things like that, or strikes, employment strikes, government shutdowns, anything that really falls outside of the realm of this is normal life, normal process. In a traditional real estate transaction, if someone doesn't qualify for a loan and therefore can't close on a property, that's foreseeable. Maybe they lost their job, or something happened and their business fell through and they couldn't qualify for a loan. That's generally foreseeable. But when somebody is unable to qualify for a loan because a pandemic has hit the world, and therefore there have been 17 million unemployment claims in the last 4 weeks, not particularly foreseeable. So a force majeure clause, depending on how it's written, will give the parties to a contract an out depending on what's happened. The reason it's pretty irrelevant for us in our industry is CAR's forms do not have a force majeure clause. They just aren't in there. And unless you have agreed to a force majeure clause in writing with the other party, they don't apply. So there's no automatic force majeure in any contract. So we don't have them in the CAR forms. What do we have? There is a civil code, and it's civil code section 1511. So civil code section 1511. And that civil code has language in it that allows parties to a contract to, in essence, say that the contract is frustrated, the contract can't go through because of some crazy unforeseen condition that we would never have expected has hit. That is the civil code that certain buyers and sellers are using to try and get out of their contracts that they entered into before coronavirus. And they need to talk to an attorney, talk about the pros and cons of that, figure out, because those are going to be fact by fact analyses of their specific circumstance in light of the civil code. There's no sweeping statement saying that anyone can get out of these contracts at all. It's going to be a fact by fact, case by case analysis over each deal, whether they can actually get out of it based on that civil code, because we don't have force majeure clauses in our contracts. People who have entered into those contracts, though, since knowing about coronavirus and government shutdowns and that there's layoffs and that we're headed, that economically everything is, we're in a recession and we don't know the length of that. If I entered into a contract today, I would not be able to take advantage of that civil code because I go in with my eyes open. I know all of it. It is all now foreseeable. I can't predict the next couple of months, but I can definitely see an issue with my performance if I'm a buyer or a seller and entering into a contract now, which is why we have the CBA addendum and amendment to allow for that additional uncertainty that's to come. So that's the long and short of force majeure, because I know that is a really hot topic. The COVID forms, again, I'm not going to go through that again and try to save time through the Q&As, but check out CAR's website. They've got some great information on the new forms. Okay, vacant property. What's the definition of a virtual tour? I don't know for certain, but my best educated guess would be a tour that you can do without being physically present. So you can do virtually through your computer, phone, iPad, whatever, would be what I think a virtual tour is. Yeah, talked about that one. Just bear with me while I read these questions and try to answer the new ones. Buyer sees a virtual tour. Do they have to make an offer and have it accepted for them to go on the premise and see the property live and in person? There is no distinction in this law about where you are in the escrow process. It doesn't say once you're in escrow, then you can go visit the property. It doesn't say anything like that. So we are under the assumption that this rule applies during the entire process. Showings, during escrow, everything. Because it doesn't draw any distinctions between pre-escrow, post, during escrow. Who's monitoring agents? That's a great question. You are monitoring agents. So agents are monitoring other agents. The bigger issue is what happens if you do it wrong? What happens if you go and show properties or do things that you're not supposed to do? The first is there are criminal penalties. It is a criminally based order. So they have the ability to arrest people. They have the ability to fine people. And the bigger issue is if you're not following the orders properly and you're engaged in criminal activity, you very likely have no insurance coverage for anything you're doing in that transaction, anything related to your criminal activity. So it's a massive insurance issue as well. Do city ordinances override county ordinances? No, it's actually the opposite. So think big to small. So the bigger one always prevails, and you can never be less restrictive. So you can never do anything against the bigger order. So we all have to follow the federal order. And then from there, we have to follow the state order. And then from there, we follow the county. And then from there, we follow the city. So the city can be more restrictive, but they can't ever violate the county, which can never violate the state, which can never violate the federal order. So it's the opposite. Follow the county first, then the city. But by the way, if a county says you can do it, but your city says you can't because you're more restrictive. A virtual tour the same as a virtual showing? I don't know. I mean, it just says a virtual viewing. I mean, it came up with a third term. I know we have virtual tours, virtual showings. They just added virtual viewings. What does all that mean? Use our best judgment to understand what that means. That really means a showing of the property where you're not physically present, or people who are viewing it are not physically present. That's really what they're trying to hit. Okay, we talked about enforcement. Who interprets feasible, MLS or the law? The law. This is not an MLS rule. This is a California county, this is a County of Los Angeles order. So this would be enforced by the court. And how this would come up most likely is someone would get coronavirus and then they would blame your showing. And there's huge causation issues, without a doubt, because part of showing anything in a lawsuit is you have to show causation. You have to show that this act or this moment or this thing caused your damage. It's in almost every single thing, except criminal penalties. You can still get in trouble for crimes without having causation if you just break the rule. But in lawsuits, let's say someone gets sick and says, I went to a showing, I got sick from that showing because I didn't leave my house for any other reason. I haven't interacted with any other people. The only thing I did was that showing. And then 10 days later, I got coronavirus and now I'm disabled and yada, 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 yada. Whether or not they can actually prove causation is a whole different story, but you're in a lawsuit, and you're in a lawsuit for someone who's become disabled due to lung problems because of coronavirus, and you don't have insurance coverage if you're not doing it properly. So that's why it matters that we're following the rules to the best possible ability, and that's who would interpret it and enforce it as well. Are you seeing buyers buy without walking the properties? I am seeing some buyers buy without walking properties, yes. We're seeing buyers buy sight unseen, and in many of those circumstances, the price is reflecting that risk. And it's also typically a very special property. Sometimes they saw it before all of these restrictions happened, and so they're very familiar with it. Other times they're confident in the virtual showings and virtual tours. Other times they actually did see it because the restrictions were different at that time. So I do see buyers who are buying. It's not that common, but I do see it. Okay. Let's say the property is a virtual tour and the buyer writes an offer. I answered that question about whether it changes after escrow opens, and we don't see anything that is changing after escrow opens. Is a 3D tour, a virtual tour, anything that you're doing where someone's not physically present, anything they're watching virtually. I've answered the virtual tour on MLS. I've answered that question. We're getting lower, guys, only 7 more questions to go. Because they are not able to ask questions and get answers on a tour, a showing is different. Yeah, a showing is different. So anytime the law says virtual viewing. So anytime someone cannot do what they need to do from the comfort of their own home, if it's not feasible for them to view it, see it, show it, tour it, any of it, that's what this covers. What protection assurance can we expect from sellers if the property's been cleaned after each showing? You just need to rely on their representation. You are allowed to rely on the representation of your sellers. So you can confirm with them. I recommend confirming it in email. Say, we just want to make sure you've cleaned it. On the CDC has cleaning guidelines that you'd want to send to your seller and say, here are your cleaning guidelines. Please make sure you follow it after every showing. And then you show it and say, hey, just want to confirm you guys have cleaned the property. It's ultimately a burden on them, but we want to help them with that. Who does the virtual tour, the agent, or do you hire someone? And only the agent and the video person are allowed with the seller out of the house. So if the seller is not able to do the virtual tour themselves, then you would be able, I think, to argue that the virtual tour is not feasible with just the seller. So then if you did the video, you'd have, yes, just the video person and the agent, no occupant in the property, nobody else with you. And that's under the county council's interpretation, which varies a bit from what the actual order says. Can the escrow be contingent on viewing it after the fact? Absolutely. Here's the big picture. If your buyer or your seller are uncomfortable with any of the rules that the county has put in place, we can't break them, but what they can do is figure out, can they wait? It's going to change at some point. They're not going to be able to keep everybody in their homes forever. So if you have a buyer who is willing to wait and is willing to say, I will go into escrow on this property subject to a viewing and extension of escrow in order to allow that, and the seller is okay with it, absolutely, you can do that. We're seeing longer escrows, by the way, when a buyer really wants to see a property and they haven't been allowed to. So an inspector can go to the property during the escrow, but the buyer isn't allowed to go into the property. Again, buyers can go in under the circumstances that we've talked about. Buyer that has access to a virtual tour essentially can't visit the property in person until escrow closes. Again, the law says that if a virtual viewing is not feasible, that's the only time that they can go in. So Denise, what I've sent also says that it can't be feasible. So if you cannot feasibly show it virtually, then you can do the in-person tour. But again, with 2 people and the agent, and that's it. Final walkthroughs for deals in the pipeline is an issue. There's no question. So if they can't do it virtually, if virtual final walkthrough is not feasible, then they would fall under this category. But if it makes no exception for final walkthroughs. I know that this is, and again, I think that these orders need to be revised and very clearly updated, but it doesn't make any distinction for final walkthroughs. So it's possible that your client would do a virtual final walkthrough, or if a virtual final walkthrough is not feasible, then they would do it with just the 2 people and the agent with all the proper guidelines. If a seller refuses doing a virtual tour, would that fall under unfeasible? I don't know. I don't know exactly what feasible is. These are all going to be, you guys have to remember, the way we know exactly what words mean and the way we understand rules and legislation and orders is through lawsuits. That's the only way we really know it. The way our legal system works is they hand down law, there's confusion and ambiguity and interpretation. People sue each other, and you get through a trial, you get a judgment. That judgment gets appealed, goes to the appellate court. The appellate judges decide, okay, I'm going to hear it, and I'm going to issue a written opinion, which I'll publish to all the lawyers. And we get dozens of those over a course of 4, 5, 6 years after a new rule has come out, if not longer. Sometimes we get interpretations decades after the rules have come out. So the answer is, I don't know. I don't know exactly what's feasible. I don't know exactly what's not feasible. And there's nobody who will be able to tell you that. No lawyer will be able to tell you that. I don't think any judge would be able to tell you that at this point. So the best piece of advice I can do is 2 things. 1, on the margins, always ask your broker. Find out from your broker what their position on it is on the margins. And 2, use your very best judgment, knowing the information you know and knowing the purpose of the rules. The second link in the chat is coming up not found. Okay, I'll re-put it out there in just a second. What if the seller no longer lives at the property? Would the listing agent be required to clean after showings? I do think that the listing agent would likely need to clean after showing if the seller is not within the area. And where should we look for this information? I'm not sure which information you're referring to, Sharon. But let me go ahead and hop in the link. And then I think that's it. Okay, see if this link worked. If it didn't work, go ahead and pop onto the first link, and then on that page is the link to the second one. And on that page, if you scroll down to guides and other materials, it's the second link under that, guides and other materials on the legal doc page. That's where you can find that. All right, so we have no more questions. Thank you guys so much. I know it is very confusing and very frustrating, and there are no perfect answers, and it's changing constantly. So I think that the key is to try and work with your broker to stay as updated as possible in order to navigate through this. It's changing all the time. All right, thanks guys.